How much you read? It's like a journal. It's like a
Right, exactly.
kind of like
Actually, that's only volume 1.
diaries are not the most entertaining.
You didn't read the joke?
Oh, this is okay. No, I didn't know what you're talking about.
All right. We'll be respectful of everyone's time today. We've got 2 hours blocked out for this meeting. Hello to everyone. Representative Horn, good to see you. We'll get started. Going to convene this meeting of the working group to examine the taxation of federally recognized tribal nations for September 19. You have, I think, in front of you the minutes from our inaugural meeting in July. If everyone has had a chance to review that, any questions or corrections?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes as presented.
Motion's been made to approve the minutes.
Second.
Seconded by Senator Martin.
Yeah,
All those in favor?
yeah, just one
Oh,
quick comment.
one
I
quick
was
comment.
on the Zoom, in attendance, on Zoom, arrived a little late.
Okay.
Okay. Senator Martin on Zoom at the last meeting. Well, a motion's been made and seconded to approve the minutes of our inaugural meeting. All those in favor? Aye,
As amended.
as amended. Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, motion carries. Minutes are approved. We'll move on to our agenda then today. We have a couple of presentations, tribal perspectives on the 2020 U.S. Treasury Tribal Advisory Committee report on dual taxation. Are the presenters ready to go? Do we flip a coin? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, we're ready.
All right,
Yeah.
we'll go with the Mashantucket perspective on the committee report. Great. G?
Okay, yeah, there, thank you. Good afternoon, Secretary, esteemed members of the working group and attendees. Natasha Jean Swift. My name is Jean Swift. I'm a member of the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation, and I'm honored to present to you all today on some of our recommendations. I'm also the former Tribal Council Treasurer and the current CFO beginning as of June 2021. I'd like to introduce the team. We have Jody Cummings, who is General Counsel to the tribe. Prior to joining MPTN, he served on the Department of Interior in the Solicitor's Office. He's a member of the Lumbee tribe, and we're very pleased that he's a part of our team. Betsy Conway, to my right, is MPTN Senior Counsel. She has worked with the tribe for over 20 years. She has extensive experience in Indian law and particularly Indian taxation. She and I had the pleasure of presenting to the United South and Eastern Tribes Board a few years back on dual taxation together. And then the third member of our team who's not present, who will be joining us, I believe, via Zoom. He was in transit and got stuck in traffic, is Jonathan Taylor. He is an economist and professor with the Harvard Project. He conducted an economic impact study for the tribe back in 2019, and he'll be presenting, I believe, at the end of this. Basically, our presentation is structured to answer many of the secretary's questions that were posed. In particular, what is dual taxation is the first question. The second one is, what is the impact on both tribes if the General Assembly enacted a law exempting taxation of personal property located on trust lands? Jody will answer that question. What agreements do the towns have with the tribes? The fourth question is, why should Connecticut take this action? And the fifth question is, what have other states done to address the issue? We will now turn the presentation over to Jody, who will provide an overview on the two distinct issues as we see it before we begin answering the various questions. And he'll also take question one on dual taxation. Jody.
Before I make any comments, I'm wondering, could we have the slides that we provided up on screen? We're good. No worries. Yeah. And while they're working on that, the other thing I would note is you all should have a copy of our slides in front of you, as well as some supplemental materials that we've provided that are in the booklets that we've prepared for this afternoon.
Senator Austin, sorry, Senator Austin.
Hey, Tony.
Yeah, can he send those out to, can he send them to the administrator and the administrator send it out to those of us who are at home?
She has it. She already has it. She'll send it out.
Okay, because I'd like to see, right on. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
We're good. Okay, so if we go on to the next slide, just so everyone can see again, these are the questions that the administrator, or excuse me, the secretary posed to the working group last time that we're going to endeavor to answer this afternoon, and Jean just walked through those. So so that I'm not repeating her, let's move on to the next slide, and this is how we really want to talk about the issues that are before us today. We really see the issues that we talked about during the legislative session with respect to dual taxation and the concerns that the tribes have presented here really is broken up into two distinct issues. Issue one is taxation of non-Indian personal property located on trust land. And just so we're clear about what we're talking about here, this would be a proposed tax exemption under Connecticut law for non-Indian personal property that's located on tribal land. So for example, furniture or equipment that's located in the California Pizza Kitchen at Foxwoods or in the Krispy Kreme at Mohegan Sun. The way that the proposed exemption is structured, the tribes would be treated the same. Non-Indian personal property would not be subject to tax by municipalities under state law. Each tribe could decide if it wanted to impose its own tax on that non-Indian owned personal property, which the tribes already have the legal authority to do, but they would continue to be able to make that decision. Issue two, separate and distinct from the question of whether non-Indian owned personal property should be exempt from state tax, is the question of the Mohegan tribe settlement agreements with the state and the town of Montville. And, we don't pretend to be the leading experts on that issue. Mohegan is here and certainly fully capable of talking about those agreements and what they mean. We're not part of the discussions. The only point that we'd really make to point out to the working group is that the exemption that's proposed to be included in state law would not impact those agreements. There's no intent to do that, and we don't believe that the exemption as written would do that. So if we could go on to the next slide. So what we're proposing to do, adding to the list of exemptions in state statute 12-81, tangible personal property owned by non-Indian persons or entities located wholly within trust land that's held for a federally recognized tribe,
by the United States. The impact to the two tribes is the same. This type of exemption would respect tribal sovereignty. It acknowledges that both tribes provide and pay for the governmental services that are provided within their trust lands. And it eliminates the threat of dual taxation that we're going to talk a little bit more about today. The other consequence is that it would reduce the tax revenue that Ledyard and Montville are receiving now, respectively, by about $600,000 for each town. Recognizing that, we'd also note that the towns receive state impact aid today, and Ledyard also receives aid from the federal government, federal impact aid. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So on to question one. What is dual taxation? Dual taxation, or the threat of dual taxation, occurs when states assert the right to tax non-Indian personal property on trust lands. As I just mentioned, tribes have a clear legal right to tax that property or to impose taxes. And a state's right to do that, or here, providing the ability of a municipality to do that through state law, is really subject to a vague, unreliable, and inconsistent balancing test that was established by the Supreme Court in a case called Bracker. Ultimately, where that leaves tribes is in a really bad spot. You, as a tribal government, are stuck between the choice of foregoing the tribal tax and losing needed revenue that would fund government services on tribal land, or you could impose the tax in addition to what the state or municipality is imposing, and you lose opportunities for economic development. You're driving away businesses who may want to locate on your tribal land, but for the double tax scenario that's presented. So next slide. So again, just establishing the basic principle, we're talking about taxation of personal property owned by non-Indians located on trust lands. Federal law is clear. States can't tax lands held in trust on behalf of tribes or personal property that is owned by tribes or tribal members that's located on trust property. And state taxation of non-Indian personal property really is based on this confusing, inconsistent, and contradictory or test that provides contradictory results sometimes that comes out of Bracker. And so where does that leave us? It leaves us with lower courts who have this uncertain, amorphous balancing test that's going to provide inconsistent results when it's applied. And we believe that the solution that we're providing in legislation creates a clear, stable environment, if you will, under which there are no questions that are left in this area for taxation of non-Indian personal property. So if we'll go to the next slide, I'll ask Jean to talk about the impact, or what the impacts are to Mashantucket as well as to the towns if the proposed exemption is adopted.
Thank you, Jody. I think it's important for everyone to understand that Mashantucket provides all of the government services within its trust land. We do not rely on surrounding municipalities for any of these services. We're 100% self-reliant when it comes to the various services. And you can see on the slide, some of those services are listed, such as public safety, the regulation of health and safety on the reservation. We have our own TOSHA, which is essentially the tribal OSHA office. All public works, including road maintenance and snow removal, the natural resource protection, education, housing, utilities, including wastewater treatment. We provide even a portion of our own electricity through a cogen facility. We have an extensive tribal court system on the reservation. There's the Land Use Commission, which does permitting for buildings and certificates of occupancy for both residential and commercial builds. And we have a historic preservation office. The tribe also bears the operating and also the capital cost for these departments and services. So although on an annual basis, you can see it's highlighted there in bold, that essentially that equates to roughly $25 million annually for the tribe to provide these various services. On top of it, we do have ongoing capital or infrastructure costs for these. Next slide, please. When Ledyard imposes a property tax on non-Indian owned tangible personal property, it takes critical dollars away from the tribe and eliminates the tribe's ability to enact its own tax and policy. As a matter of fact, in many cases whether it's the town or the state imposing a tax, that our taxation basically takes a second seat or is given as a credit against being able to assess additional or taxes that we would need to fund these services. We also observed that in this instance with Ledyard, it creates somewhat of an inequitable windfall to the tribe's expense of roughly $600,000 annually. The tribe needs this money, as I spoke of before, to fund these services and also to invest in ongoing critical infrastructure. Since the pandemic, like everyone else, we've seen just incredible increases in cost and also labor. And so often trying to afford and pay for things such as a new fire truck or something with costs with our police department, it becomes a bit of a challenge to make some of those payments or to be able to set the funds aside so that we can afford those. Next slide, please. Ledyard had previously cited that education and road maintenance are the justification for the cost in assessing and kind of overreaching and collecting these dollars. But as you can see on the slide, there's 4 different points that kind of counter this. And 2 I'd like to draw your attention to is, one is that Ledyard receives federal impact aid specifically for the education of tribal students. The Johnson O'Malley, and there's other impact that they receive, other aid. The other point I'd like to highlight is that Mashantucket Pequot spends over $80 million or spent over $80 million to improve Route 2, which is the main road that's adjacent to the tribe's resort. That was out of our pockets. Again, the impact that Ledyard alleges is costs that we typically bear. It's important that we impose to you or impress upon you that keeping these tax dollars in the jurisdiction where the services are provided is a matter of equity. And all non-Indian jurisdictions in the state of Connecticut enjoy this right to impose taxes within their own boundaries without fear of other municipalities kind of overreach. So this is an unfortunate situation for the tribes. Next slide, please. This is the final slide on question 2. What is the impact? Ledyard collects, again, approximately $600,000 annually. However, the state pays Ledyard grants in lieu of taxes on trust lands that equates to, in 2021, just under $380,000. MPTN pays Ledyard $800,000 annually in property taxes that are for lands that are held in fee. So we have the 2 Trees Inn, which is located in Ledyard. We have other properties, whether it be commercial or residential. This would not change. So if this exemption were to be adopted, they would still continue to collect, rightfully so, property taxes for taxes in fee, which are located in Ledyard, just as they would continue to collect the $379,000 and change from the state of Connecticut. Finally, Ledyard receives approximately $1.6 million annually, $1.6 million annually in federal impact aid for education that is related to simply tribal children. So that impact aid is significant. And again, we don't see that changing under this exemption. I'll now turn it over to Betsy to talk a little bit about question 4. Thank you, Betsy.
Thank you, Jean. Last time we visited, there was a question why should Connecticut act and address this issue in the absence of federal action? I think was the way it was framed. Why is this Connecticut's job to kind of come in and act on these issues? First wanted to point out that the federal government has taken some action when they created the Treasury Tribal Advisory Committee. We'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, but so they have taken some action, and there's a report that will discuss their recommendations. And one of those recommendations out of that report was that the much better way of dealing with these tax issues is for tribes to work with states so that states can address this and avoid litigation, which is uncertain and very costly to everybody. The federal law, as Jody mentioned earlier, is very confusing. It's conflicting, and it does lead to litigation. And one thing that I really wanted to make the committee aware of is the state of Connecticut and the tribes in 2001, 2002 timeframe worked together on a very large issue of sales tax, sales and use tax. And the tribes went to the Department of Revenue Services and actually drafted a revenue ruling. And they had many meetings with DRS. And ultimately, the two sides came to essentially an agreement, which has taken the form of a revenue ruling. And I really commend Connecticut for doing that at the time, because it was a time where there was going to be litigation on the issue. We're dealing with the same balancing test. And so today we have a good set of rules because Connecticut acted with the tribes at that time. And we have worked under that revenue ruling for 22 years. We work very well with DRS right now. We often have conversations with DRS on these issues. It really set up a very good relationship between the tribes and the state to deal with very thorny tax issues in a way that avoided litigation. So I would just suggest that that's a great precedent for Connecticut. And I think this is another opportunity to do the same here. The Treasury Tribal Advisory Committee, you heard a little bit about this last time we met, and this was established in 2014. There's 7 members. They advise the U.S. Treasury Secretary, or the Mohegan, it's Chief of Mohegan Tribe, Lynn Malerba, sat on it before she became the treasurer of the United States. Gene Swift also has sat on this committee, and now Rodney Butler, the current chair of the Mashantucket Pequot, is sitting as a member on it. And they were, you can go to the next slide. They were set up to advise Treasury on a variety of tax issues. And one of the things that they did was set up this subcommittee on dual taxation. And the dual taxation subcommittee released a report in 2020, which we've included in our materials. And it really provides a good historical and legal context for dual taxation across the country. So it provides some of the concerns with dual taxation across the country. And I thought it was interesting there, the desired objective of this dual taxation listed in this report is that tribal nations as sovereign governments shall be the only taxing authority for all businesses and economic activity occurring on and within their reservations. And so that was kind of the goal that they set out, or said that that's what tribal governments are looking for. And the conclusion of that report was that successful tribal government-owned businesses create positive economic environment, both for local and statewide, but the taxes paid to the state and local governments don't come back to the reservation in the form of services. And that really hurts the tribes and the infrastructure and programs, and weakens those economies. And hopefully Jonathan Taylor will be able to join us. Hopefully he's able to, join us a little bit later, because we've asked him to really talk about that exact issue. What is the economic development impact of dual taxation. And he's worked with Harvard Project for years, and they've done studies across the country, and he can share that with you, what their findings have been on economic development in Indian country and how it has a positive impact to states and local communities. Finally, on the last slide, the next slide, on this question 4, why should Connecticut? We present to the group that we believe it's good tax policy that encourages economic development. The tribes are providing the governmental services, but the taxes are being imposed by an outside government not providing those services on the reservation. We would submit that we think this is poor tax policy, and it's just not right, just, or fair when this is occurring. Tribes are sovereigns, as we've mentioned, and have educated, throughout the legislative session. Obviously, they're sovereigns that have experienced some historical trauma. But despite that, the tribes and the state have worked together so well over the years. When you look at, where we started in the early 90s, before gaming, through gaming, and now where we are today. And we think that the best way to do that is by recognizing tribal sovereignty. The tribe's economic impact on the state has been significant. Again, Jonathan Taylor will share with you just some of that information, just the job growth on the reservation, the amount that it's produced in income tax revenue, and other things that he'll go over, including the gaming revenue from both the slots contribution, which we've talked about, 4.5 billion over the years from Pequot, and another, I think 4.2 or higher from Mohegan. And now with iGaming, we're seeing additional revenues going to the state in tax dollars there. I also am going to just touch, I just have one slide on what have other states done in this area. And I know that was another question that the committee was interested in. And so we've done a lot of research over, different states, but I pulled out a few of the states and have given you citations to their state statutes. And you can see that it's a variety of ways that they've addressed it. And a lot of these statutes are addressing sales and use tax, because that generally is a much bigger number for states and for the tribes. So you'll see that a lot of it, North Carolina is probably taken the broadest approach in addressing not only sales tax, but also property tax, and saying that they essentially exempt everything on the reservation from those taxes. Other states, like I think it's Nevada, they base it on, look, if the tribe has a tax that's similar to the state tax and you're collecting that tribal tax, the tribal tax will be collected and the state tax won't be. Again, I think that's more in the sales tax arena. Mississippi has one that they are not levying taxes within the reservation of the Mississippi Choctaw. And then you have states like Michigan, Oklahoma, Washington, Wisconsin, and several others where they've passed legislation essentially saying you can enter into agreements with tribes. So many of those agreements that you see throughout the United States will address sales tax issues, income tax issues. They'll address a whole variety of issues. And this is all to avoid litigation, frankly, with tribes, so that they find it's much more productive to come to agreement with the tribes and to address it in that way, as opposed to litigating these issues. So those are a few of what the tribe's done. And I think I'm turning it back over to Jody now.
Yeah.
Okay.
So. Yeah. Great. So that's basically all of issue 1, just dealing with the non-Indian personal property tax exemption. And then on issue 2, and that really takes us back to question 3 of the 5 questions that the secretary asked. So what agreements do the towns have with the tribes? And so, I want to make these really short. I mean, there's 3 or 4 slides here, but there's just 2 main points. One is that other than mutual aid agreements that we have, we do not have any agreement like the Mohegan tribe has with the state or with the town of Montville concerning pilot payments, with respect to land taken into trust or personal property that's owned by the tribe. But the other critical point in our view to take away is that, like I said at the outset of this, was that the proposed exemption, when we're focused on non-Indian owned personal property located on trust land, if that is enacted into state law, would not, as we read the agreements that are in place, and again, I don't want to substitute my description for anything that Mohegan would provide on this, but it would not impact the language of that agreement in any way. And so, we believe the issues can be treated distinctly, and that that exemption that we're proposing could be enacted without affecting anything beyond non-Indian owned personal property located on trust lands. So, Gene, do you want to finish up with our takeaway slide?
Thank you, Jody. We tried to summarize here kind of essentially what we've included in this presentation deck. The first point being, as Jody just articulated, there are 2 separate and distinct issues, which are really important to understand. The first being, I think, the task of this working group, which is looking at dual taxation, specifically when it comes to non-Indian owned tangible personal property located on lands held in trust by the United States government for the 2 federally recognized tribes. The second issue is the Mohegan Tribe's settlement agreement. They have 2 settlement agreements, if you will, or agreements, one with the state and one specifically with their town. The second big takeaway is that tribes are governments, and they provide and they fully fund all of the various governmental services, programs that are offered to their tribal communities, to the tribal businesses, to the tribal tenants. And it's important that they have the ability to be able to provide these services by assessing tax in the way that they see is appropriate. The third takeaway is the proposed exemption is limited specifically to the non-Indian owned personal property that's located on trust lands. It's very specific. And the fourth and final takeaway is that the tribes are treated identically under the exemption. This is very important. And that concludes our presentation. We do ask that, again, if Jonathan Taylor is able to join us, perhaps before we close out the session, that he can provide some of his important takeaways regarding economic impact.
Secretary, I understand that Mr. Taylor is available if the working group would like to hear from him.
Sure.
Yeah.
Is he on the call? Great.
Yeah. He
I
should be.
am.
Go ahead, sir.
Good afternoon. I'm sorry I'm not present with you. It was my full intention to be there, and I'm talking to you from a rest area on the Massachusetts Turnpike, right next to one of the longest traffic jams I've ever been in. So apologies. I think if it's okay, my understanding is that my slides were in the packet, probably at the end of the package of slides that were just up.
Yes, I believe that's correct.
All right. Is it possible to share those with everyone?
The administrator is getting there. Hold on 1 second, sir.
Sure.
While
Hi.
we're waiting, I think Senator Martin has a question.
Yeah, thank you. I won't be able to stay for the whole presentation, but currently do any of the tribes have a land lease with any third party?
Yeah, we do have leases in with a number of them. Yeah. So we have several.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah. So a good example is the Tanger outlets.
And how are their taxes for personal taxes handled?
So they would pay personal property tax. They and their vendors who are subleasing from them, they would pay personal property tax to the town of Ledyard on their, whatever would qualify as personal property under state law.
Okay, thank you.
While we're waiting,
I might be able to share from my screen if that's allowed.
Susan, is he allowed to share? Yes. Okay, go ahead. You can share, sir.
Okay, great. I'm just calling it up now. Give me a second here. Okay, can people see my slide?
yes.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Jonathan Taylor, and the first order of business is to tell you a little bit about who I am. I wear a number of different hats. I've been affiliated with the Harvard Project. It used to be called the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, and it recently changed its name to the Harvard Project on Indigenous Governance and Development. And I've been affiliated with them since being a graduate student in 1990 through 92. I'm also a program associate at the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona, and I'm a consultant, a private consultant. And the reason to talk about my background is to highlight some research that I've participated in, and then talk to you about some particular work that I did for the Mashantucket Pequot tribe, an economic impact study. We've been at it for 30 years or so. We've been doing research like this publication about how to get economic development going, what kinds of things are required to develop program effectiveness, to develop institutions of self-government, to develop enterprises, and so on. This is a publication that we all worked on in the early 2000s. It's published by Oxford University Press on the state of affairs in Indian country at the turn of the millennium. This is some peer-reviewed research. I and my colleagues are routinely in the business of submitting our research to journals. We've also done white papers. We just did one recently for the Wabanaki Nations in Maine. And of particular interest to this proceeding is a co-authored paper I wrote with Kelly Croman, who is an attorney, on the issue of dual taxation. And this is an example of our working paper series that you can sort of think of them as preprints and discussion drafts. What we see in case after case, in tribe after tribe, and broadly in the social statistics across Indian country, we see that Indian self-government is really effective at changing conditions on the ground. The state of Indian country could be fairly characterized as a resurgence. It's an economic resurgence. It's also a social and cultural and community resurgence. And this is a policy we sort of generally and informally refer to the period from 1975 to the present as the self-determination era. And this is a standout among federal policy experiments, including privatizing reservations in the late 19th century, or disbanding reservations in the middle of the 20th century. And this is the single most effective era in terms of moving the needle on Indian poverty and rural underdevelopment on Indian reservations. The key thing to recognize about all this is that self-government in Indian country entails doing all the business of government. It varies from tribe to tribe and state to state and ecosystem to ecosystem, but in general, it entails everything from treating sewage to taxing economic activity, or using taxes as a means of spurring economic activity by competing to have lower taxes, just the way New Hampshire tries to entice me to buy a bottle of liquor every time I return to my home state of Massachusetts. And what we see is that this development that's happening, while people, the common person could be forgiven for thinking that it's about casinos, it's not only about casinos. And this data on the right really surprised us when we found it. We looked at the 1990 census and we compared that with the 2000 census. And we divided the reservations of the United States into those that had casinos by the year 2000 and those that didn't. And what jumped out at us was this non-gaming column. That is to say, there was a tremendous movement in the per capita income of Indians who live on reservations, 3 times almost the national change. This is adjusted for inflation, on reservations that did not have casinos. So what's going on there? Well, I think there are several different layers. I'm just going to talk about 2 of them. One is general enterprise activity. We see tribes making more effective use of their forests and selling 2x4s and things like that. So natural resource industries have been big. Casinos have been big, of course. But also, surprisingly, tribes are making money in healthcare. Oftentimes, Indian reservations are the best or the only provider of rural healthcare, and they make net income for their governments in that sector. And then tribes have also made progress over the last few decades in federal procurement. The number of people employed in tribal government is one thing, but then tribes are employing their people in forestry enterprises, mining enterprises, procurement enterprises, hospitals, clinics, and then casinos and their related businesses. And what we see also in case after case is that the growing economies on Indian reservations don't come at the expense of the economies around them, like some people have argued from time to time and place to place, but actually come to the benefit of those surrounding regions. When tribes' economies grow and deepen, they provide jobs for their neighbors, they provide better public services which spill over to their neighbors, and they provide improved infrastructure. And here are some examples. These citations are referred to in my last slide, and many of them are available online. When tribes take over their government and displace outside decision makers, be that the federal government or oftentimes local opportunists, they get more effective and valuable uses of the same natural resources. That's just the economy doing more with the same amount. And that redounds to the benefits of the non-Indians who work in, let's say, the tribal timber operation. Self-government produces better emergency response times and greater public satisfaction with emergency services and also with hospital services. There's a lot of variety and experimentation in Indian country, and what we notice at the Northwest Indian Treatment Center, which is operated by the Squaxin Island tribe in north of Olympia, Washington, they're ranking in the national statistics for substance abuse recovery, which is a really hard problem, is best in the country, top 3%. I mentioned high quality rural health and wellness, top ranked job quality. Oftentimes tribes find themselves competing with each other and with other businesses, and they amplify the benefits packages and other amenities of work and get top rankings. More infrastructure, more highway growth, and so on. And often this growth is taking place in regions that are desperate for it. Now, I mentioned I did some research for the Mashantucket Pequot tribe. This was an economic impact study. You have the full study, I believe, in your materials. I just want to go through some of the findings in brief. At that time, the tribe and its tenants employed 9,700 people and paid 77% of its payroll inside Connecticut. 80% of that in-state payroll was paid in zip codes that were below the median zip code in per capita income. So in point 3, 3/4 of Foxwoods gaming dollars then and now come from out-of-state patrons. So just to summarize those 3 together, Mashantucket Pequot is an export economy that is helping the Connecticut economy and employing people in some of the regions that need per capita income the most. That economic activity, of course, translates into various different impacts. Directly, the tribe withheld $31 million in federal income taxes, $8.8 million in state income taxes, and $40 million in Social Security and Medicare taxes. As that economic activity ripples out into the economy, a total of $145 million in direct Connecticut state and local tax government revenue is produced, and another $52 million in indirect and induced economic activity. When we look in point 6 at the realized gaming revenue from the tribes themselves, it's almost a third of the corporate tax revenue at that time in fiscal year 2018. These benefits required no abatement or relocation incentive or exemption or any other kind of Connecticut tax expenditure. And the direct payments made by just the Pequot tribe at the time of our study just about cover the Connecticut business exemption for sales taxes of machinery and manufacturing and the research and experimentation tax credit. I think this is not entirely news to all of you, but I thought I'd present an updated version of figure 2 from my study. This is a little bit busy. Let me walk you through it. The blue represents the Mashantucket Pequot tribe, and the red represents the Mohegan tribe. And the wiggly line that displays a lot of seasonality is the monthly version of those two revenue contributions to the state of Connecticut. And the darker solid line, dark blue and dark red in each case, represents the 12-month moving average that tries to take out some of the seasonality. And what we see over time is that there was a substantial growth in the 1990s, a plateau in the early 2000s, and then competition came in. And on the right-hand axis in orange are the gaming positions that are in states near Connecticut. So let me unpack that a little bit. There's a rule of thumb in studying casinos to aggregate positions, that is the number of slot machines and the number of seats that are at the different tables, poker tables and other table games. And so positions is just a calculation of slot machines plus 7 times the number of table games and poker tables. This gives you a sense of the capacity of a casino. And in terms of nearby, this is for Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Southeast New York. Think about it as the city and the Catskills. And it's very pronounced how much the competition has increased from about 5,000 positions nearby in 2005 up to around 25,000 currently. Also in evidence on the graph are the recessions as indicated by the National Bureau of Economic Research, including in 2020, the recession that accompanied the pandemic, and that's visible in the shutdown of revenues here. So I want to make 2 points with this graph. First, as Betsy pointed out, these numbers are very substantial contributions in dollars over time. But these dollars, of course, were $1995 in 1995 and $2,000 in the year 2000. When we convert those all to inflation adjusted 2022 dollars, the total is almost $13 billion over the life of these 2 casinos. It's a substantial contribution to the state treasury over this time. The second point to make is that as competition has come to the surrounding area, it has become more and more important for both tribes to work on ancillary economic development. The premium now is higher, if you will, on the federal procurement work, the healthcare work, the other industries work that can't call on the drawing power of 2 facilities in Eastern Connecticut without competition from out of state. Whoops, sorry, hit the wrong key there. Let me just get that started up again. Beg your pardon. I've got one more slide. Just bear with me, sorry. And it's to talk about dual taxation. I mentioned the paper that Kelly Croman and I wrote. It's a bit of a long paper. Let me try and give you the highlights here. Number 1, routinely around Indian country, state and local governments don't have much responsibility for the public goods and services on Indian reservations. Partly because it's true and partly because it's convenient. They repeatedly and routinely point out that's a tribal problem and that's a federal government responsibility. So we see in location after location, the tribe has to do all its own fire suppression work, resource management work, foster care and other work. When state and local governments tax reservation economic activity without contributing to the reservation public goods and services, tribes face a Hobson's choice. There's already a tax on the economic activity that's taking place on their reservation. They could add another tax, sometimes to the level, if they were to reap the same amount as the state was reaping on the economic activity, they'd be higher than any other state or other jurisdiction in the country. Doubling it takes you to beyond first place, or don't tax it at all. And the consequence of that is underinvestment. When the tribe has to think about raising the money or issuing the debt or finding the cash to put in a new water treatment system or pave real estate development or pave a mall or something like that, they can't count on being able to commit tax revenue. So what happens is those kinds of projects fall to the bottom of the list. Maybe they fall off the list and don't get any investment at all. When tribes do proceed under the uncertainties of dual taxation, as Jody and Jean and Betsy pointed out, they face delay and they face complexity and they face uncertainty and they face litigation and the cost of litigation. And so to summarize our point in our paper, tribal primacy in on-reservation taxes puts the resources, the decision-making, and the investment potential into the right hands, that is the tribal hands, and produces more of the economic development we see in Indian country that produces benefits for non-Indians. This last slide is the references, and some of these links will take you to the papers. Thank you, and I appreciate your forbearance with my weak computer skills and my mobile office here. I feel like I should have a canine department or something behind me. Thank you for your time, and I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Anything else from the Mashantucket tribe? Questions of the group on this presentation? Representative Horn?
I was pausing
You guys
sort
go
of whether,
first.
as to whether I wanted to answer the question, ask my question sort of at the end of both presentations or now. But so I really want to thank you for the presentation, the really focused presentation that you presented early on in this, which really, this issue gets, I think, spoken of loosely in a way that doesn't help really narrow what the issue is. And I'm really very grateful for the clarity with which you presented it here. I think it will really help us get somewhere. And then we sort of zoom out to, self-government issues. And I'm assuming you're not arguing that the Mashantucket Pequots aren't able to self-govern because of Connecticut's taxation, the local taxation here. So just to be clear.
Well, part of self-governance is being able to create your own tax policy. So certainly, as we've pointed out, there's a lot of self-governance going on at Mashantucket. So clearly it doesn't take it away, but it takes away a key component of self-governance, which is to develop your own tax policy within, and then to be able to tax if you want to, or as I think Jonathan noted, or maybe you have a different tax rate to develop economic development. But I think that aspect of self-governance is hindered by the threat of dual taxation.
Got it. And could you, just for my own clarity, what is the taxation system? So say personal property that we're talking about here that's owned by, owned tribally or owned by, an Indian owned personal property. In what manner is that taxed by the Mashantucket Pequots?
Yeah, it's not taxed right now. It's not taxed at all. There is a tax there's a $75 tax, I believe. It's a minor tax on residential homes on the reservation, but there is no personal property tax on tribal members on the reservation right now.
And is that a tiny category? I mean, because we're really talking about the personal property principally that we're talking about here is property that is, owned by non-Indians and used on the casinos.
That's right.
And that's a big category, or general, not huge, but
That's
and I
right.
assume that
Yeah.
Indian owned personal property is not as big a.
That's
Or is
right.
it?
I
Okay.
mean, the biggest personal property and like the towns, I think they're not really taxing, individual beds and things like that. But what they do tax is the businesses and their property. So yeah, there was an earlier question about leases. I mean, we have, Wahlburgers just went in, CPK, California Pizza Kitchen. We have Hard Rock Cafe. All of those are owned by non-Indian companies, and all of that equipment that they may have, the tables, the chairs, anything like that's not, some fixtures wouldn't be taxed because they would be considered real property, but anything that is not considered real property would be taxed right now by ledger, not by the tribe, because the tribe if they were to put another tax on, it would discourage why would CPK want to come to the reservation if they could locate somewhere else and not have to pay double tax?
That makes sense to me. And forbearance, Senator Austin has not imposed her usual 2-question minimum yet, so I will ask one more. And that is, now I've lost track of my question. What?
How about we come back to you?
You've shut me down. Without even doing it.
How about we come back to you?
I'm very well trained. You can come back to me. Thank you.
I think Representative Walker is on the call and has a question.
Thank you. And I want to thank everybody for their presentation. I've learned a lot and I've got a lot more questions that I've learned. My first question is, how long has the taxation been levied by Montville and Ledyard to the tribes? How long has that been in existence?
At least since 2006, because it's at least since 2006, I would say, and then it is increased since 2013. But I would say at least since 2006, and maybe Mohegan, it may be different, and we'll leave that to Larry Roberts to answer. But I know that Pequot did not have a lot of lessees initially. They had all their own restaurants initially when they opened, and they ran for quite a while with their own restaurants. So they wouldn't have been taxing that personal property owned by the tribe.
And the premise was because of the fact that people from outside the tribe were setting up shop on the tribal lands. Is that correct?
That is correct. The premise was this is a non-Indian that owns property on the reservation, and they considered that to be, I guess, part of the town, and therefore they had the right to tax that. Yes, that's my understanding.
And and you also get money from the feds, am I correct? For the children that are living on the tribes, is that correct?
That is correct. The town of Ledyard receives roughly $1.6 million annually.
How many children does that represent? 1.6. Does anybody know?
I'm not sure of exactly the number, but our understanding is that includes children who live on the reservation as well as other children. And I think in our slides we described it's federally connected. So children of service members or other folks who have some connection to the federal government. There's some benefit provided in connection with their children as part of that number.
So do they provide you with educational facilities or research or teachers or any of those things for that 1.2 million?
No, there's no unique services that we have. But Betsy,
Yeah. And this money is going to the town of Ledyard. So it's not coming to the tribe. This is money that the federal government is providing to Ledyard, because the premise is that if there's a tribal child who's living on the reservation, they are not paying property taxes because the reservation land is not taxable. So a town like Ledyard, collects its property taxes from everybody and funds its schools that way. So the federal government has stepped in and said, okay, we're going to help you with this could be for military, like on the base. There might be property on the base that they can't tax. So the federal government has stepped in and said, we will pay a certain amount to help fund those educational services for tribal children who live on the reservation.
Is there any representation from the tribes with the town councils in Ledyard or Montville?
That's a great question. So I do know that we've encouraged tribal members to participate in on the Board of Ed. And we actually do have, I think, 1 or 2 tribal members that currently sit on the Board of Ed. So that's kind of a newer development.
That's recent?
Correct.
And it's, I'm sorry. I only got 2 questions. Really, Kathy? Okay. All right, I'll come back.
I have been very quiet. Jeff is running the meeting, so you can ask him. I have been very quiet here. Both of you and that other representative over there are blaming me, but I am not running the meeting.
I'll leave myself in the tender mercies of any casual observer as to who is running the meeting.
I was just gonna say, like, whoever believes that
I'll
Kathy's
give it a
not
shot,
running the
though.
meeting is, there's some
Minutia.
tomfoolery going on here.
I know, I will, in due respect, I will come back and ask my other questions. Thank you.
Very well. Representative Cheeseman, I believe, had some questions.
Thank you. And I've been reminded not to try and break the rules here. Obviously, you have businesses operating successfully on the reservation. What revenue do you derive from them? What's the agreement? Is it just a lease payment? Do you get a percentage of sales? What revenue do you derive from those businesses operating on the reservation?
So typically our lease agreements are hybrid. So there's a base rate and then there's also a percentage of sales that's usually laddered.
Okay, and does that $600,000 of lost tax revenue you anticipate to the towns include the proposed Great Wolf development, or is that just the currently existing tax revenue that would be lost were we to institute the end of dual taxation?
That's just the current piece.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Cheeseman. I believe Mayor Allen is on the line and has a question.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to clarify, because I've heard it twice now, the $1.6 million of federal impact aid, that does include the military dependents as was stated. So the federal impact aid on a per child basis is about $5,240 per year. As you can imagine, the cost to educate, and our most recent number coming from Mashantucket was 150 children in our schools. But we're currently at about $16,500 per pupil. So if you back out federal impact aid, ECS, even if you were to back out the $665,000 of personal property taxes, we're still far, far below the $4.9 million of educational expenses. So I feel like we're going about this each time for this, and the reality of it is, if we were made whole on the educational side, I think there's a different story to be told, but we haven't gotten there. And I know that there was a case made last year for increasing PQAT fund, which amazingly came out of the committee very favorable, but didn't get a vote. So I am happy to share the math on the educational costs, but that's really the elephant in the room, so to speak, on the financial aspect as it pertains to the town of Ledyard.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mr. Cummings.
Yeah, just on that, thank you. We'd really like to see the math on that. And just one clarifying question based on the numbers you just mentioned, the 4.9 million, if I heard that correctly, are you saying that is the cost for educating just children from the reservation in Ledyard schools?
Right. So that's the 150 children plus the special education costs, which we have at an average of $50,000 per pupil. So like I said, I'm happy to send along the math in an email that can be shared with the committee. But these are the numbers that we have.
Okay, I'm going to be respectful of everyone's time. Mr. Senator Martin.
I just have one other question before I leave. You mentioned revenue ruling. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. It's a ruling that it was like a decision or ruling that came from the Department of Revenue Services. I believe it's 2002-3 and what it was they went through 11 or 12 issues, Department of Revenue Services, and said things like, can a sale of meals on the reservation be taxed by the state? That was like one of the issues. And then they answered that question. No, meals will be taxed by the tribe, not the state. And they went through 11 issues, and we have lived with that revenue ruling to make that decision to make those payments, as opposed to we would have had to litigate each one of those in the courts, because it's, it's us selling to a non-Indian. So if we sell a meal to a non-Indian, there was an argument, well, we should be able to collect some of that tax. But then the revenue ruling looked at the law and determined, this is DRS, they made the decision that no, in that situation, the tribe should collect the tax. In this situation, retail at Tanger, the state collects the sales tax. So they collect all the sales tax. If we sell a sweater, that sales tax goes to the state. We also do have, we do add an additional 1% at the tribe that does go to the tribe, but the sales tax 6.35, is it? That's collected and that's sent to the state. That was based on that revenue ruling.
And what was the ruling on the personal property tax?
It did not consider personal property. It was just sales and use tax.
Has there been a question asked of them as to how they would rule on that?
Department of Revenue Services, when we've talked to them about it, it said this is really not their area because it's with the municipalities. So they really do not feel that they can make a ruling on personal property tax, is my understanding from them.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Other questions for the first time? I'd like to be respectful of everyone's time and give the Mohegan Tribal Nation a chance to present today. We have to finish at 3, so we're about 45 minutes left. I have a bunch of questions. I'm going to put them in writing and send them to everybody so you can respond at our next meeting. Any other questions of anyone here for the first time? All right, let's go with the next presentation then.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sagoli Swageku, Nyongets Larry Roberts, Onioda Aga Ni Wakadun Hunjoda. My name is Larry Roberts. I'm a member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, and very happy to be with the committee today. I want to share with everyone that Chuck Bunnell sends his regards. Unfortunately, he is traveling back from Korea today and unable to be here. And I want to start my presentation by apologizing for missing the first meeting because I hadn't realized that the questions the chairman posed would be covered at this hearing today. And so I've been sticking with the agenda and I intend to do that. But I just want the chairman and this committee to know that Mohegan will be providing responses to all of your questions either before the next meeting or at the next meeting at your convenience. I'm new to Connecticut. I recently took this job with the Mohegan Nation, and prior to that, I have served most of my legal career at in Washington, D.C. So back in 1995, I was a fresh kid out of law school and took my job at the Department of Justice as a trial attorney, and served as a trial attorney for a little bit more than 5 years and was able to work on a wide variety of national litigation issues, including issues regarding multiple tribes in a particular state with regard to resolving litigation that was very acrimonious between the 5 tribes, the state, and the United States. And one of the things that helped me be part of that experience is that I took away really that a goal is to avoid litigation at all costs, right? It's much better to sit around a table like we are doing today, reach solutions that work for everyone that's involved in the discussion, because litigation leads to acrimony. Litigation leads to, hard feelings because there's a winner and there's a loser. After the Department of Justice, I worked in private practice for a number of years, representing tribes nationally on a variety of issues and involving Indian gaming, restoration of tribal homelands, issues near and dear to every tribe in Indian country. In 2010, I joined the National Indian Gaming Commission as the general counsel, so advising the federal regulatory agency that oversees all of Indian gaming across the United States. And it was my honor to serve there with Chairwoman Stevens. From there, President Obama appointed me to the Department of the Interior and Indian Affairs, where I took a leadership role over a number of years, including the last year of the administration leading Indian Affairs. That's where I got to know Jody. He joined after I had been at Interior. We had always sort of known each other and bumped into each other at various circles, but where I really got to meet Jody and know him was when he joined Interior. After President Obama, his term had ended, I returned to private practice and soon was offered a job at Arizona State University Law School and taught Indian gaming, administrative law, and was developing programs on tribal self-governance and Indian gaming. And so I am not going to go the professor role. Again, I will try to keep this short. I will try to, be engaging, but not take too long. And then prior to joining Mohegan, I served, had the honor to serve the current Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, the first Native Secretary in this nation's history, as her Chief of Staff. And so it was an amazing experience because I got to work on issues that affected all of the issues that Interior deals with outside of Indian Affairs and including Indian Affairs. So it's a long way of saying when I started my legal career, I had black hair and I wasn't wearing reading glasses. I'm now just trying to hold on to the hair that I have. I want to start by saying that Mohegan is supportive of this body's efforts to bring fairness and parity to taxation on Indian lands. And we appreciate the opportunity to engage with you all during this process to reach a solution that is fair and equitable. In giving our views with the agenda on the the Treasury Tribal Advisory Committee's report, the work that you all are doing is extraordinarily important. Taxation issues on the federal level involving the respective taxing authority of states in Indian country, those are really difficult issues. They're hard issues. And as this committee has recognized, those issues are hard because the courts have applied a test that is really incomprehensible. It's a balancing of the interest test, and it really depends what judge you're in front of. This balancing of interest tests that the courts use, it's inherently inconsistent, right? You can have two judges looking at the same issue, balancing the federal interest, the tribal interest, the state interest, and looking and coming to a different result. And Congress from time to time has addressed that situation. The Indian Gaming Regulatory Act is a good example of that. Their Congress legislated and said, we're not going to balance interests anymore with regard to Indian gaming, and we're going to take into account the unique interests of various tribes because all tribes are different. And so we're going to try to put all tribes on an equal and fair playing field. We tried to address taxation during the Obama administration. We promulgated regulations on leasing that attempted to address this issue. We also looked at issuing regulations under an old statute where Interior licenses Indian traders within Indian country. We didn't have time to finish that latter part, the Indian traders, but it was one of the few issues that early on the Trump administration agreed with the Obama administration on that. And they were pretty spirited in picking up that mantle until the House Committee on Natural Resources held a hearing, and for whatever reason, the department did not move forward on those. So I'm not aware of any pending federal legislation or pending rulemakings that would address this issue that you all are taking on. So again, your work is very important. The report that the Tribal Advisory Committee issued, it reflects the federal approach of parity among tribal nations, taking into account their unique circumstances. In fact, federal law prohibits the executive branch from classifying, enhancing, or diminishing the rights of one tribe vis-a-vis another tribe. So during the Obama administration, they formed the committee as Mashantucket noted in 2014 and 2020. The report was issued. It's an excellent report on this issue of dual taxation. And it was a result of work done by now Secretary and also Mohegan Chief Lynn Malerba. And the report really calls out the disparity among states on how they're dealing with this issue. It calls out how states like Nevada are working with tribes to meet their unique circumstances. It also highlights the economic impact of tribes. And as we all know in reading the report, it highlights the economic impact that Mashantucket has made through their exercise of their sovereign rights. And Mohegan has a report as well that we are happy to provide this committee, which shows the economic impacts of Mohegan. I want to just highlight, though, the importance of the report. It highlights the importance of parity and tax parity, right? In the report, it talks about parity among states, but it's also important to have tax parity among tribes, and that's what Mohegan wants. We want parity and fairness. So, and this body has done that. I think, you know, again, I'm new to Connecticut, but I think the most recent example of that is the sports betting legislation that this body passed, right? It treated both tribes with parity and fairness. I want to talk a little bit about Mohegan and its recent history. And unfortunately, I'm not sure about everybody in the audience, but probably all of us, it's history within our collective lifetimes, right? In 1977, the tribe filed a land claim against Connecticut to return its Aboriginal lands that were unlawfully taken in violation of federal law. And although the Mohegan government predates the United States, it had a petition in 1978 to get the Department of the Interior to recognize their federal acknowledgement. And the acknowledgement process was a long and slow process, and it met strong opposition. It met strong opposition by the Connecticut Attorney General's office, starting in at least 1985, and the tribe wasn't even recognized until 1994. So you're talking about over almost a decade of opposition, fierce opposition from the Connecticut Attorney General and unfortunately the town of Montville. The town of Montville hired a DC law firm notorious for opposing tribes and were quite vocal in their opposition to the Mohegan tribe's recognition. And in 1994, despite all of the opposition, the Department of the Interior recognized the Mohegan tribe for its inherent sovereignty that it had and that it continued to maintain from the time of first non-Indian contact to today. And I just want to pause at this point because the tribe had finally received recognition from the Department of the Interior, and they were facing fierce opposition from the state, fierce opposition from Montville. And they were presented with a Hobson's choice. They were presented with the choice of sign agreements with the state and with the town of Montville and resolve all of these challenges, or don't sign these agreements and face continued litigation that we know takes at least a decade to resolve. And so what did this tribe receive under these settlement agreements with the state? Again, the tribe had a land claim for at least 2,500 acres and probably more of its Aboriginal lands. So what came out of that land claim? The tribe did not receive any land as settlement of its land claim. The tribe paid the state $3 million to repurchase its own burial grounds from the state. I don't know what the present value is of that. I know we've heard discussions about present value, but the tribe had to buy back its own burial grounds. It agreed to extinguish nearly all of its claims to its homelands. And it agreed, if we can use that term, to make payments in lieu of taxes on any real property over 700 acres that are placed in the trust to amount dollar for dollar equal to what would have been paid if it was held in fee. And with regard to certain exemptions that are really rather so with regard to the taxation of real property, agreed to pay dollar for dollar, unless otherwise provided in a local agreement. And so I also just want to share with this body, 700 acres, it's not a lot of land. It's one of the smallest reservations in Indian country. Sure, there are small reservations in Connecticut. California, but 700 acres is a ranch in Montana owned by a tribal family. Okay, so it's not a lot. The state, what did the state do? They agreed not to challenge the placement of the tribe's burial ground in trust that it repurchased. And they agreed not to challenge the tribe placing up to 700 acres into trust. It agreed to enter into gaming compacts with the tribe. It agreed to pay the tribe a sum of $1. So what happened next? The tribe reaches agreement and they sign an agreement with the town of Montville. The tribe agreed with Montville to pay $500,000 every year to the town's capital budget. I don't know what the present value of the $500,000 is from 1994. Anything over 700 acres, that agreement provides them to make payments in lieu of taxes on real property, same as assessed within Montville. It also provides for them to pay payments in lieu of taxes on tribally owned motor vehicles and personal property, with limited exceptions. The tribe agreed to pay for the lobbying services of the town in this agreement, agreement. It agreed that everything over 700 acres was going to be taxed dollar for dollar, the same as fee land. The town agreed to support legislation to extinguish the tribe's land claim. And the town agreed to support trust acquisitions up to 700 acres. And so I want to also just say I'm not going to talk about, I'm not authorized, I don't believe, by Mohegan Tribal Council to talk about any other tribes' land claim settlements and what they received and what they did, and I wouldn't in this body. But what I will say is that when you look at the agreements, they talk about taxation. They talk about real property taxes. They talk about personal property taxes that the tribe is going to pay. And saying that it's a separate issue is like saying we're going to pass legislation to address climate change and we're not going to look at greenhouse gases. It's like we have an agreement here that we have concerns with. And so I think, some folks will say the agreements, you don't have anything to worry about. Your worries are Mohegan. Your worries are not solid. They're not sound. And our worries are not whether we win or lose. Our worries is that this body would pass legislation that would put us into litigation. The Mohegan tribe has worked for decades to have a strong relationship, to move past the animosity that existed at the time that it signed this agreement. And we're worried that if this body passes legislation that does not address these agreements, that we're going to end up back in litigation with Montville. So I will just say, we support the ending of dual taxation. We support finding a solution that works for everybody. But we want a fair and equitable solution. And at its core, this body is trying to resolve wrongly decided litigation, wrongly bad case decisions for Mashantucket. It's wrongly decided. Look at this last meeting, you all talked about the Oklahoma Supreme Court. They made the right decision. That case was wrongly decided by Mashantucket, in opposition to Mashantucket. It was a wrongly decided case. We're also trying to address bad settlement agreements of litigation that are antiquated, and quite honestly, I'm the outsider, I'm the new person here, but the settlement agreements, I don't know how you can say that they were fair. So I know that the hour is getting late. I'm happy to talk about any other issues, answer any questions that you have, but I think I'll cut it short there and just say Mohegan is committed to a solution here.
Thank you. Questions of the group, either here or online, for Mr. Roberts? Let me clarify in my own mind then, what you're talking about. So, assuming we could get to the narrow issue, and I have questions about getting to the narrow issue, but assuming we could get to the narrow issue of what's proposed, which was the legislation around a fairly narrow property tax exemption related to personal property of non-tribal members, for which there is a fiscal note out there. You're saying there's an additional issue that the Mohegan tribe would need resolved to be supportive of that. We couldn't just pass that, you say, because there'd be litigation. So there's an additional issue that would have to be addressed that has a fiscal note that I don't know the answer to. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, because I think the short answer is by passing legislation without taking into account the settlement agreements, I don't know that you're solving anything. I think you're creating litigation.
Okay. I think I understood that. Well, we have some time left. I think it might be useful for me to ask some questions then, since we do have some time left. To the issue of taxation. Both statements, principally the Mashantucket statement today and the presentations, go on about dual taxation and what dual taxation represents to you and the meaning of it. But to be precise, the situation here is not one of dual taxation. Am I correct? It's simply that the state has supplanted or taken up the space that would otherwise be taken by you in taxing this property of these people, because you're not now taxing it, I think you said. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is correct. We are not taxing because we feel like we can't tax.
Okay.
So we're not taxing because we've made, or not we, the Pequot tribe has made a decision that they don't want to tax.
So we don't actually have a dual taxation situation here. We simply have a situation where the state's taxing. You'd rather we didn't. So you then would have the option of doing so or not.
That's correct. But we do think we call it dual taxation because it's a threat of dual taxation that stops us from,
Yep.
but what you're saying is accurate. The only place that there is in the sales tax arena, but not in the personal property tax.
I understand Representative Walker has a question. I'm gonna let her get in here.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, Attorney General Roberts. I kind of want to pick up where Mr. Beckham started talking. Somehow we have to understand what it is about your land trust that you are trying to resolve, because if I understood what I heard from you, you are saying that has to be a part of this equation in order for Mohegans to participate in any of the changes. Is that correct? Is that what
So what I'm saying, did we lose her?
No, I'm here, but my
Okay. All right. Sorry, you faded out.
camera, I'm in cheap property area.
Yeah, what I'm saying is when the tribe places any land in the trust over 700 acres,
Mhm.
and the tribe takes the position that this legislation without addressing the agreements passes, and we say we're not going to make any of those payments, and neither are our non-Indian lessees or vendors, I would anticipate that we would face litigation from the town of Montville. I can't speak for Montville, but I would think as a municipality, they would seek to enforce their agreement with us. And so I think we need, legislation that makes Montville whole for those losses.
Okay, so what you're saying is that whatever deficit that Montville would incur if we do some reversals or changes in the taxation laws, you want to make sure Montville gets made whole by the state? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Okay. So will you be able to provide us with that information to the committee so that we could evaluate what that is. I understand the idea is not to let anybody end up with a deficit, but at the same time, there are some issues here that I think are contrary to what we believe in business and we believe in sovereignty. And so I think it's mixing issues, and I understand that's your focus and your interest. But I think there are different entities, different issues that we're trying to resolve and understand. And we're not trying to make anybody have a deficit, but because obviously we in approach, we don't want to do that. But the other issue is making sure that we have equity in the laws on taxation and revenue gain. So I sympathize with you, and I really would like us to try and understand it a little bit more in detail what you're talking about. But I think there are different issues, and hopefully we'll address those issues. But I think that we should all have a balance, whether it be in land or taxation, education, healthcare, all of those things. Okay.
Let me, I'll try to be clear, but I guess our concern is we take land in the trust over 700 acres, and there's a law in the books that says non-Indian personal property is not subject to taxation. And on acre 701, we lease the land to Walmart, and Walmart doesn't pay the personal property taxes because that's the state law. Our concern is that Montville will say, under our agreement, personal property taxes are to be paid, and we will sue you. And that's the concern, is that we then end up in litigation. And so it is really addressing the issue that's before you. And again, I want to emphasize, we also oppose dual taxation. We think what this committee is doing is the right thing to do. We have an agreement that addresses this very issue, and we need to, we would like the state to help us avoid litigation.
Okay, I thank you for clarifying that, because I was a little confused, but I also feel that taxing entities and not providing the services is also wrong. And I believe that we should, if the tax dollars that we pay should be returned to our communities in the whole, in many ways. And we're trying to do that with other cities in the state of Connecticut. So to me, just me, I'm learning more and more, and I'm a little shocked at all the things that you Mohegans and Mashantuckets are being taxed for, but are not receiving the services. And that to me is something that we should not be endorsing. So thank you, sir. Thank you.
Representative Horn has a question.
Thank you. I had a question that, so I note that other states in their approaches to this, so take Nevada, for example, says that if tribe has and this is more largely in the sales tax area, but you could analogize to property tax. If the sales tax equal or greater than the state's tax, then the state will not collect it. So it's basically keeping it, if you were to step in and to start to tax and in this case, to be clear, again, this is not a state tax. It's not the state that's collecting these taxes. It's the municipalities that are assessing these taxes. Then it would sort of, do any of you take a position distinct from other positions in terms of that approach to this?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously it's one way to come at it. We have not had further discussion internally about if that was the legislation that was provided, whether we would fully support that or not. But obviously, that leaves the tribe with no choice, and that's, we can impose our own tax as long as it's equal or greater than the state's tax. I think that's a more reasonable circumstance than, the way the law currently sits. But, it's not something we've evaluated fully. Yeah.
So part of the reason I suggested is at least it would provide parity if one is paying and the other isn't paying. I recognize the money doesn't go to the same place, but
Yeah.
Yeah, the money doesn't go to the same place. I would, I think Mashantucket has done a wonderful job of providing a variety of options here of what other states are doing in an overview. And I would point out, Michigan, for example, they have tax agreements with all of the different tribes that are both uniform, but also meet the unique needs of each tribe. That's probably a good model. It's not an uncommon model. It looks like 4 other states, including my home state of Wisconsin, is one of those. I'd need to look closer at those types of agreements, but there's lots of different models.
Wisconsin making a lot of news these days around public policy and other matters, just to point that out. Representative Cheeseman has a question.
Thank you. So again, to try and bring some more clarity to this, given your agreement with Montville, which was part of the original decision that allowed you to proceed with acquiring the lands and getting federal recognition, absent legislation from the state of Connecticut that said, if at any point you exceed the 700 acres and become subject to the property tax under that original agreement, we, the state of Connecticut, vow in perpetuity to make you whole, you feel you would be subject to litigation on the town of Montville, by the town of Montville. Am I being too dramatic here, or is that basically your fear? That if at any point the terms of the agreement were violated by the end of the ability of the town or any town to tax that real personal property, you fear litigation would be the result unless the state committed in perpetuity to make that town whole?
So I think we only have an agreement with Montville, so it would be Montville. I can only, I can't speak for Montville. I know that they're part of this body. I don't know if they're online today. Okay, so I can't speak for them about, what they were litigate, but that is my concern, is that, and, in perpetuity, I guess governments always, and, we're talking about, at least 2 sovereign governments and a local government. We that's what governments do, right? They negotiate and they work through problems to reach solutions. And so would it be in perpetuity? I don't know. Maybe Montville would come to the table with the 3 of us and we could, figure out a solution.
Thank you. I believe Mr. Allen online has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sir, you touched on a subject just a few moments ago, which involved state sales tax. And I believe what was mentioned was dual taxation as it pertains to personal property tax. And as it currently sits, it is considered a threat of dual taxation. However, state sales tax is actually dual taxation right now. Is that not true?
So right now on the sales tax, it depends on what you're taxing. But if, say retail, you buy a sweater at a store at Tanger, we collect 100% of the state sales tax. And in addition to that, we add 1% that goes to the tribe. So I don't know if you'd call that dual taxation. It is 2 sovereigns taxing the same thing. The tribe has decided to add that to get a little bit of revenue there. And I guess it's worked out well enough where it is not decreased competition for that, although I don't know if we've ever done studies on that. In other areas, I don't think there is any dual. So for instance, occupancy tax. The tribe collects occupancy tax, its own occupancy tax. The state does not collect that on hotel rooms. That's another example, but that's all under that revenue ruling, that agreement that we came to with the state.
I'd just like to add that in the instance of sales tax and the retail scenario that Betsy just painted or just described, we actually, our tax, EMPTN tax is 7.35%. And we issue a credit that's equal to the Connecticut state tax rate. So essentially we are forfeiting everything except for 1%. And that's really how it works. So just wanted the committee to be aware.
Can I ask, following up on that though, so that is an area where there's dual taxation and we're sharing the revenue. Is this, would not this property tax change be precedent for, well, if the statements about dual taxation and sovereignty or something we're supposed to adhere to, then we should let you have all of the sales tax revenue, it sounds like. Wouldn't that be consistent with the statement and the principle that's been enunciated?
Sure. Sure. Or no, absolutely. But at the time, because we were really trying to avoid litigation on this issue, we basically made an agreement to forego that tax, while meals, the tribe collects occupancy tax. And it's because of this test that everyone's described as incomprehensible. It really is incomprehensible. But one of the things they look at is whether you add value on the reservation, whatever that means. And every court that looks at it says it's a little different. But the revenue ruling was looking at, look, you're cooking the meals on the reservation, so you're adding value. And that's how they got to that one. Retail, they felt it was more, you're bringing a product on and then it's coming off the reservation. So that's, that's why that one we agreed, okay, and it wasn't a split at the time. It's exactly what Jean said. Thank you for correcting that. It's that the tribe decided to institute its own tax and then give a credit. Yeah. But you're right. I mean, all of these different things are different examples of sovereigns working together to try to resolve it in a fair and equitable manner. And I think what the tribe is saying is right now, it is another sovereign coming in, taxing it and taking it all off the reservation. And the tribe having to provide those services, and that's not fair and equitable. So that's why we're here, obviously.
What would you say about the income tax then, for activities on the reservation?
Yeah, I mean, that's another one which could go into litigation. Now, we wouldn't, I mean, right now, it would be, when you talk about income tax, are you talking about like employees?
Mhm.
Yeah. So employees, we've always collected, although there's some question whether we do it as we have to for our employees. But certainly for like a tribal member who lives on the reservation, there may be a distinction there on whether they would collect the income tax there. But yes, we do collect. A lot of those people live in the state of Connecticut. And so they're off reservation using the services of the state, so it is a little bit different with income tax. But all of these issues would have to be looked at. You're absolutely right. It's all, you look at each tax a little differently.
Okay. Other questions of the board? I don't want to take up all the time. I do have a couple more. Would you say that the need, you said $25 million is your operating budget, and you have a capital budget. You didn't give me the total for that. What's the source of that budget? What are the revenue sources?
So the 25 million is the cost for those particular government services, but we actually, it's in excess of that because, I mean, the whole point of tribal businesses is for the benefit and the perpetuation of the tribal membership in the community, the culture, the people. So we have cost of caring for our people, our community. And so it is more than the 25 million, which is just the operating cost of the services. The capital is afforded or funded essentially by many of the tribal businesses. So the earnings we receive from the tribal businesses help too. But we've had to really do a lot of delayed maintenance over the years. And so a lot of our infrastructure is really, it's pretty strained.
Mm-hmm. Would you say your need for additional tax revenue is a need for more resources for those purposes or an economic development tool? It was alluded to that you could do, you'd have the option of not having the tax, which could incentivize businesses to come there. Is it, where would you land on that?
It's both. And honestly, it has to do with what Betsy said earlier. It has a lot to do with the tribe being a sovereign and having tax sovereignty and basically the ability to make those decisions. And I would anticipate it would be more of a hybrid approach that we would take. but certainly with a lot of the deferred infrastructure, as CFO, if I could presume upon the council, I would definitely want to see that would be made a priority.
And one thing just to add, which is unique for tribal governments, is they often have to fund with commercial, what other people would think of as commercial activities. So gaming, people think of that as a for-profit, but under IGRA, that has to go to government services. It is to fund the tribal government. The tribe doesn't have a tax base for the land because it's land held by the US. So they don't have like the what we would think of. So they have to do it through businesses or through some tax revenue when they can. So it is a little
I just want to second what Betsy's saying. That's exactly right. I mean, federal law requires tribes to use every dollar of their Indian gaming revenues to support the services that they provide to their citizens. And so I'm sure Mashantucket Pequot is you look from the outside, we're both very successful tribes, right? The largest casino resort in North America, Mohegan doing well. But we have lots of unmet needs for our citizens, a ton of unmet needs, and housing is one of them. And so, every tribe is going to decide how they use their revenues and their tax dollars. If we're able to resolve this solution, I would think Mohegan is going to look at housing, and because we have a housing crisis at Mohegan, quite honestly. We have elder housing, but we are limited in our land base at the moment. We're acquiring more lands, but we have lots of unmet needs, and I'm sure. Again, I'm sure I see Jean nodding her head. There are lots of unmet needs for both tribes.
Other questions from the group or either tribe today? All right, we're coming near the end of our time then. We've had questions and some discussion. We have to set a new time and date for the next meeting and an agenda. My thought was, and I think, I hope this is agreeable, that we hear from the towns next. They seem to be the stakeholders who have, something to say about this issue, I assume. So maybe the towns could present a reaction to what has been described to date at our next meeting. What do members think about the next meeting? 30 days, is that too far, about the right number? All right, we're going to work with the staff of the Appropriates Committee then to set a new meeting then roughly 30 days from now, sometime in October.
And in the interim, Larry, you have more things to present and answer those questions. So I don't know.
I'm happy to submit the questions just in writing to the committee if that's most expedient, and we'll work on that to have that done before our next meeting.
Okay, thank you. All right, there's one more item on our agenda.
Motion to adjourn.
I hear a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Seconded, it's not debatable. All those in favor, aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
To adjourn are debatable,
All
just so
right.
you know.
We're adjourned. We'll see you next month.